سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم سبحانك لا فهم لنا إلا ما فهمتنا إنك أنت الجواد الكريم وقل رب زدني علما اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا بفضلك وكرمك علما وعملا. So before we get into the second halaqa, so apparently last time we didn't really have a good reception on a lot of the media. So what we're going to do, we're going to go through the last halaqa quickly, so it'll do two things. Number one, the people who didn't get it, they'll get it, and the people who got it, they'll get it again. Which means, تكرر تقرر. We say in Arabic, if it's repeated, then it sinks in and it'll probably have more impact. So we'll just get started here. So we started in the first halaqa with the Sirat of Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam, and this is always what we need to start with, myself and all of us included. So to prepare our minds and prepare our hearts, particularly our hearts, because we are seeking knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives Himself. This is direct, tanweer from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's an enlightenment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we always want to put our focus towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, focus on our objective, why are we here, and particularly the etiquettes which are due. Particularly we are talking about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so with the utmost of etiquette and the utmost of reverence towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam, so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may enlighten our hearts with his character and with his his message, and so that we become on his example with his tawfiq. Okay, so our intention, our objective, our niyat, so to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which has to be the niyat for everything that we do, and learning the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so that we increase our love for him and our desire to follow him, and in so doing that, inshallah, hopefully Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give us actually tawfiq to do that. So we talked about the station of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has himself described his love and his praise, and his position with Prophet. And indeed you are upon a most exalted character. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam the most exalted of characters. And also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions how he has sent a prophet who is concerned about us, who is concerned about humanity, and whatever afflicts us, it's actually a matter of concern for him. It's an amazing quality. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us something of that concern also, and have that appreciation for that Rasul Kareem alayhi salatu wasalam, who had such a concern, not simply for himself, for his family, for his people, for the entirety of humanity. We have not sent you except in mercy for the entirety of humanity. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has elevated his status, and we mentioned that whenever the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioned, then generally the name of Rasul is mentioned thereafter. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu, etc. Similarly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala invites us, moreover orders us to obey him and obey his Rasul. Wa ati'ullah wa rasuluhu in kuntum mu'minin. If you are in fact believers, then obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and obey his messenger as well. Allah give us our tawfiq. Similarly, وَمَن يُطِيعِ الرَّسُولَ فَقَدْ أَطَاعَ اللَّهَ. And the obedience of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam is in fact obedience to Allah Jalla Jalaluhu himself. Who obeys the messenger obeys Allah. قُلْ إِن كُنتُمْ تُحِبُّونَ اللَّهَ فَاتَّبِعُونِي يُحْبِبْكُمُ اللَّهُ وَيَغْفِرْ لَكُمْ ذُنُوبَكُمْ. And if you indeed love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to inform us that if in fact we do have love for Allah, then the proof of that will be that we should follow his Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam. What will be the outcome? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself will love us, and he will also forgive our sins. And then Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam, in his own words, describing himself and his position, بعثت من خير قرون بني Adam, and so he mentions that he has been sent in the best generation of the children of Adam. So the time of Rasulullah wasalam, he was the best of creation, and he was also risen at the time of the best of humanity, the time of his Sahaba, radiallahu ta'ala. And he also mentions, alayhi salatu wasalam, and Sayyid will be Adam Yawm al-Qiyamah. I am the Sayyid, and we mentioned that Sayyid is the leader, he's the chief, he is the most exalted one, and much more than that. So Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam will be the Sayyid of the children of Adam on the Day of Judgment. وَأَنَا أَوَّلُ مَنْ شُقَّ عَنْهُ الْقَبْرِ, I'm the first whom the graves will be opened, I'll be the first to exit the grave, and also وَأَوَّلُ شَافِيًا وَأَوَّلُ مُشَفَّعًا, and I will be the first to intercede and the first to be granted intercession and permission for intercession by Allah Jalla Jalaluhu. Allahu Akbar. Similarly, أَنَا أَكْثَرُ الْأَنْبِيَاء تَبْعًا يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ, I am going to be the most followed on the Day of Judgment. I will have the largest following, the largest ummah among all of the prophets on the Day of Judgment. And I'll be the first to knock on the door of paradise. Paradise will not open until Rasulullah himself, his Mubarak hand, actually knocks on the door. The door will be opened for him and for humanity. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows those who enter. And also, Nabi alayhi salatu mentions that he has been favored over the Anbiya alayhi salatu wasalam by 6 things. That number 1, he has been given the Jawami al-Kalim, those comprehensive succinct sayings where he, within a few words, he has this huge comprehensive meaning which other creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are incapable of coining such phrases, in such statements that have such comprehensive and such deep underlying meanings. And I have been assisted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by casting fear into the hearts of the enemies, Nusrat al-Ru'b, and in another riwayat, Masirat al-Shahr, in the distance of 1 month, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and 1 month was a very long distance by camel in those days, so very long distance, you could say probably at that period of time, he would put a global ru'b, a fear into the hearts of the enemies of Islam, and just as he put love into the hearts of the people who were lucky and who were not enemies. And the spoils of war have been made lawful for me. The ghanaim, the spoils of war were previously, as we mentioned, not legal for the previous ummats, and that was a special favor of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for this ummat, for Rasulullah for this ummat. And also the earth has been made a masjid and a tahur, a masjid and a means of purification, so when water is not available, so even we can actually purify ourselves with the use of the earth itself. And I have been sent to the entirety of humanity. Other prophets have been sent to a specific nation, a specific ummat, and Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam mentions, وَأُرْسِلْتُ إِلَى الْخَلْقِ كَافَّةً, I have been sent to the entirety of creation. And then ultimately and finally, خُتِمَ بِي النَّبِيُّونَ, and the lineage of the prophets, or the line of the prophets, has been completed by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then we mentioned also that Nabi ﷺ has told about the succession of choice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the very people that he's from, the Arab nation, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inna Allah astafa Kanana min waldi Ismail, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen the tribe of Kinana from among the progeny of Ismail. Wastafa Quraysh min Kinana. And then Quraysh were the ones who were chosen and selected above others from among the sub-tribes of Kinana. And then Wastafa min Quraysh Bani Hashim. And so Bani Hashim, a further sub-tribe, a subdivision of the tribe of Quraysh, they were actually the most preferred of all of the sub-tribes of Quraysh. And then ultimately Wastafani min Bani Hashim. And so Nabi alayhi salatu was chosen from Bani Hashim. So the best of the best of the best of the best. That is our Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam. Okay? So having said that, that took us to the mention of the Arab tribes which our Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam was from. And so therefore, to have a bit of a better understanding and a more deep respect and and sort of love and affection and connection with our Rasulullah, having a connection with his ancestry. And the ancestry of the Arabs, which is an amazing history actually. And that's something that, I would recommend to myself and to others, those who have the determination and wherewithal, some time, that really look into it. It's fascinating actually. So the early history of the Arabs, we mentioned that there were basically three categories of the Arabs: the ones who have perished long ago, and those who came the second uprising, or the second sort of proliferation of the Arabs, who are what were known as the pure Arabs, the first being known as the Arab al-Ba'ida, then the Arab al-Aruba, and then finally those who assimilated into the Arabic nation, the Arab al-Musta'raba. So we also mentioned that the perished Arabs, those who were totally annihilated, except for very few, that perhaps from those few that perhaps did remain, the second wave of the Arabs came to be. So those were the Ad and the Thamud, to whom Hud and Salih alayhim salam were sent to respectively. And we also showed a little map showing that where Ad actually was centered in southern Arabia, and then Thamud was in the northern part of Arabia. And so after the advent of the Arab al-Ba'ida, who were totally annihilated by their disobedience and their arrogance, so the next wave of the Arabs, or the next sort of community of the Arabs which developed and progenited, was what we call the Arab al-Aruba, and that began with Qahtan, and he's the father of that line of the Arabs. And the most notable achievement historically about that particular era was the advent of the kingdom of Sheba, and which ultimately Bilqis radiallahu anha, she actually was the queen of that kingdom. And as we probably know, that Sayyidina Sulaiman alayhi salam actually invited her towards Islam. She having accepted, so he also married her, so she became one of them. And he used to actually visit from time to time there to Yemen. And then ultimately, there was a very famous dam that we mentioned about, the dam of Marib, which ultimately broke. And actually, because of their disobedience, also ultimately, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent various afflictions to them, and ultimately they had a very great agricultural establishment, and a very intricate and very complex irrigation system which flowed from the dam of Marib, and that dam broke. It probably due to their disobedience, and as a result of that they were scattered, and they further went to various areas of Arabia. So that's, you can see on the map, they were basically in the area of southern Yemen, particularly around the area of Hadramaut. And thereafter we also talked about how these Arabs eventually spread out to various places, and the various sub-tribes of the Arab Aruba, Qahtan, beginning with Qahtan, and the Qabilat of Jurhum, which ultimately settled in Mecca, and then Himyar, which remained in Yemen, and then the Qabilah of Qahlan, which also migrated into various areas of the Arabian Peninsula, and sub-tribes populated the various areas as described in this map here. So we can see that in the area of Mecca, so Khuza was in the area of Hijaz around Mecca, and then Aus and Khazraj, as probably we are aware of, or we should be aware that those were the two main tribes in Medina Munawwara when Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam came to Medina Munawwara. And so we trace their history back to Yemen. They're originally from Yemen, from Kahlan, and they ultimately settled over there. We have Bani Ghassan, who settled in the northern areas, and then we have also Tay and Kinda, which are not mentioned, but they were also sub-tribes of Kahlan. And then of course Lakham, which was in the northeastern part of the Arabian Peninsula. And then after that we also talked about, mashallah, we talked about the Arab al-Musta'raba, and those are the assimilated Arabs. So those are the Arabs which were the mix between the original and the pure Arabs of Yemen, after the marriage of Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam with the princess of the, or you could say the daughter of the, something like princess you would say, because the chieftain of the tribe of Jurhum, she was married to Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam, which was the second marriage. It was an interesting story that we'll talk about in more detail when we come to Ismail alayhi salam in our third halaqah, inshallah ta'ala. So from that progeny came the Arab al-Musta'araba. So those were the Arabs who were the mixed, assimilated Arabs, if you like, the Arabized or the Arabized Arabs, for lack of a better term. So here's kind of a diagram about them. So Ismail alayhi salam, among his children were Nabit, and it's mentioned actually that he had 12 children, and we'll talk about that later, inshallah, when we talk more about him. And then from Nabit, so his progeny eventually settled in various areas in the northern area of the Arabian Peninsula, in Syria and Iraq. And then after Nabit, actually, there was Adnan, but actually Adnan was actually the progeny of Qidar. So Ismail, then Nabit, and Qidar, and actually Adnan was from the descendant of Qidar, which I had made another correction to the presentation, but it didn't show up this time. So perhaps next time we'll have it, inshallah. So in any case, so Adnan, you could say, was something like from the great-grandchildren of Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam. So the Adnanis, or the Adnanians, or the progeny of Adnan, they settled in the various areas of Arabia as well. So we have the Hawazin, which were in the area of Hijaz, and particularly around the area of Taif and surrounding Taif. Qatfan went to Najd, and Thaqif also were in Taif. Actually, Thaqif is a sort of a sub-tribe of Hawazin, and Quraysh, obviously, as we know, settled in Makkah and around Makkah. And there's sort of a diagram of those various tribes. So we can see Hawazin. We can also see among Hawazin is Thaqif, and that's in the area of Taif. We see Quraysh had settled there in Makkah. And then Qatfan were there, in the area of Najd. And so this is how the Arab tribes began to, spread. And all of those tribes, I would suggest that, look at this from time to time. And because these tribes are going to be coming up in Sirah. So it's not just, history, because ancient history, but the fact of the matter is that these tribes and we'll see the link and how Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam was very much, into knowing where people were from. That's a very important aspect of Arabic culture, particularly the older Arabic culture, knowing from what tribes and knowing one's lineage and who was from what tribe and what was your history. And Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was one of the most knowledgeable of what we call the ansab, or the lineage of the Arabs and the Arab tribes. And that was leveraged, wonderfully in the path of Dawat, when Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam was actually inviting, the various, tribes and the various, Arabs from the various tribes. So they would introduce that, who are you, where are you, and what tribe are you from? And so Abu Bakr said, oh yes, your tribe and your grandfather was this and your great grandfather was that, and you did this, and you had this generous person in your tribe, and you had this very courageous. So the people would get very happy that, how you know us, so right. So that's so just keep in mind that these tribes, and it's interesting that we have people from these tribes to this very day. They're still around. And while I was a student in Makkah, I remember some of my classmates from among the Saudi students. They had last names of these tribes. So they're still around. Alhamdulillah. Okay. So now let's go to halaqah number 2. In this halaqah, we're going to go back even farther. Because when we talk about the Arabs and we talk about Ismail alayhi salatu wasalam, so we have to go back to Ibrahim alayhi salam. And as we know that Sayyidina Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam, as he himself has mentioned, and as the Quran very prolifically mentions in so many places, that Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam and this ummah is on the millat of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. So we're going to look at his life briefly. So we'll just take some bullets right now, and then we'll go through these bullets one by one with a little bit of detail. So, number one, it's pretty hard to really put a finger on ancient history going back this far. I mean, we have biblical sources, we have our own Islamic sources, but obviously it's not like riwayat of hadith where we have a sanad, so and so narrates from so and so and so and so, and we can actually verify these narrations to Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam, or those people who came after him. Now, going back that far in history, we don't have that, and in fact, the sanad, this whole concept of the chain of narration, this is peculiar to the ummah of Islam. We are the only people who have this. Nobody else has it. I mean, the Christians cannot say we have an unbroken chain of narration up to Jesus alayhi salam, or similarly, more so, the Jewish community up to Musa alayhi salam, and others who came even before that, obviously, more so. So this is very peculiar to us. So we can't really, pinpoint a lot of these things, but according to, our history, and perhaps sometimes we also take from the history of other historians from the Ahl al-Kitab, and that's not a big deal because it's not about halal and haram and aqaid. So we're a bit more lax in accepting these things as long as they don't they're not in conflict. And we'll probably be looking at some of these things because some of the traditions that are with the Jews and the Christians are absolutely not are not in line with what our texts have mentioned to us, whether it be Quran or in Sunnah as well. And we'll mention some of that today perhaps. So it's mentioned that Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, something around 1800, 1600 BCE approximately, so it's quite a while back. Now, it's also noteworthy that his family were polytheists. They were mushrikun. So it wasn't like that. This is the amazing thing about Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, and he was on fitra. He was on the natural propensity of the human being to recognize his creator. Subhanallah. Of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created him like that, and he guided him into that, but it's very noteworthy. Otherwise, there was nobody around to influence him towards Tawheed. This is an amazing thing, so just think about that. So here's a young boy, he's surrounded by polytheists. There's nobody on the planet, that actually is a muwahhid, he was a person of Iman and Tawheed. So they say that he was born in a place called Ur, which is near present-day Kufa in Iraq, and he never accepted that pagan religion of his forefathers. He was, as I mentioned, from very early on, he mentions that while he was even a small boy, he actually not only didn't go for it, he actually stood up against it. And so it's mentioned also that they ultimately, because what we hear about, generally in the Quran, we hear about the discussion of Sayyidina Ibrahim and the conflict between him and the ruler of that day, which was probably Nimrud, which was probably in Babel, which is, it's also perhaps Haran. They mentioned Haran, and Babel it's in the same general area. Again, we don't know exactly, about that, exactly where that took place, but that was the center, that was the seat of the government in those days, and it was the seat of authority in those days. So ultimately he traveled there to the seat of, and that was, where Nimrud, the king, the very, famous tyrant king, lived and ruled at that time. And later after that, he left, and we're going to talk about that a little later, and how that came to place. So he left, and with his wife Sarah, and with his nephew Lut, alayhi salam. We'll talk about that also in detail. And then ultimately, Lut settled there in what is now known as the Dead Sea, in that area of the Dead Sea, which is near the place called Karak in Jordan. And it's a place called Al-Ghor, and it's a place which is very I think it's the lowest place on the planet, as a matter of fact, or one of the lowest. In any case, Lut alayhi salam remained there. Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam with his wife, they further migrated on to Canaan. Now, Canaan is what we call modern day Palestine, Lebanon, Syria. That whole area was known in those days as Canaan, or Canaan, or Canaan. And so from there, they ultimately went on to Egypt, when we have a very amazing story about Egypt. And in Egypt also is where actually Sayyidah Hajar alayhi salam came into the picture. And later on, the migration of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam with Hajara and Ismail to Makkah to Mukarramah, which was known in those days as Bakka. Okay? And then Ibrahim alayhi salam ultimately visits there to Bakka. They build the Kaaba with Ismail, and ultimately he's buried actually in a place called Hebron by his two sons Ismail and Ishaq. Now, we don't really have a confirmation of that in the Quran or in the Sunnah, which is undisputed, but this is basically what is mentioned, Wallahu a'lam. Okay, now let's look at the map, and then we'll go back this point by point. So we mentioned that he was born, in a place called Ur. So you can see that it's right here, which is right in the sort of towards the end of Iraq, and then ultimately he travels with his father and his nephew Sayyidina Lut alayhi salam to Haran. Now there you see Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam gets not only, it's amazing, not only he doesn't believe in their religion, but he actually opposes. Now just picture this. This is a young boy, who knows, maybe a young teenager. And here you have, they say that Nimrud, Wallahu alam, that they say there was a few people who actually ruled the world in those days. So at least the world that lived around him, that was around him. So he was like this tyrant king that had total authority. Like Pharaoh and Nimrud and these individuals, they were like, they played semi-gods, in front of the people, and people, either worship them or semi-worship them. I mean, that's the type of authority that they used to wield. Now here's this young boy, and he just challenges the whole system. This is amazing, right? And he tells his father, Ya bati, lima ta'budu ma la yasma, wa la yubsir, wa la yughni anka shay'a. My father, why do you, worship this, which doesn't hear you, doesn't see you, he doesn't do anything for you. I mean, it's just logical, And, and then he mentions, that I fear that you are actually just being led on by shaitan, and you're going to become his friend, and you're going to end up with him. So, and then they had all these deities, that they used to worship. And so, very interesting story. And what happened ultimately, it culminated in, he after everyone left, from their function with their deities, so he's left back behind. He's looking. He says, "Look at this shit. They can't talk, they can't hear, they can't do anything." So he picked up an axe and started chopping them. Now, can you imagine this? This young boy is just destroying all these idols, And then he takes the axe, as it said in this, and he hangs it around the neck of the big one. Okay? And so, now the people come and see their idols have been smashed. Now, if they had any sense at all, they would say, these idols can't even defend themselves, so why are we worshiping? No. Who has done this to our idols? Men fa'ala dhalika bi'alihatina. Who's done this to our idols? Oh my God, it's amazing. So just see how Allah guides some and how He misguides some. It's such a obvious, idiocy. Why are you worshiping these things? So now they say, probably it's that boy Ibrahim. He's been bad mouthing our idols a lot, and so probably he's the culprit. So they bring him. Anta falta hadha bi alihatina ya Ibrahim? Are you the one that did this to our alihat? He said, why don't you ask them? There's this guy, he's got the axe, so why don't you just go ahead and ask him? So now they started thinking, hey, you know what? He's talking sense. you know? And they almost started, wow, hey, maybe we should. No. Don't leave the religion of your forefathers. Don't let your tradition and your all that die. No. Help, come to the assistance. And come to the assistance of your gods. Your God need your assistance. I mean, they're supposed to assist you. No. We have to assist and help and defend our idols and our gods. So now they say, well, this guy's got to go. Okay? This is too much. He's gone too far now. We got to go. So what do? Allahu Akbar. They're not just going to kill him. They want to really prolifically make an example that nobody is going to think about ever even considering or mentioning anything like what this young boy did. So they made this huge fire, and it was so big, and they wanted to burn him, but they couldn't. And you couldn't get near the fire, so they got this big catapult, and they tied him to the catapult, and they're going to throw him into the fire. Now this young boy again, there's nobody around to help him. There's nobody encouraging him, say, that's right, you're on the haq, don't worry, inshallah. Nobody's there except Allah. Inna Ibrahim kana ummatan. He was an ummah. He was a whole nation of and to himself. Now they shoot him off in the catapult and he's on his way into the fire. The angels come. Ya Ibrahim, can we help you? He said, have you been sent by Allah? If it's from you, I have no need. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants, then of course I'm in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's order and his obedience. So if he sent you, fine. If it's from your side, hasbi Allah wa ni'mal wakil. And this also mentioned in hadith that when he was thrown into the fire, this is what he mentioned: hasbi Allah wa ni'mal wakil. Allah is enough for me, and he's the best one to look after my affairs. And there's also mentioned in riwayats that the knowledge of Allah, in my condition, he said, at least ask Allah to help you. He said, ilmuhu bihali yunini an su'ali. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge of my condition, it makes it such that I don't need to ask. I don't need to ask. He sees what's going on. If he wants to help me, he'll help me. If he wants me to burn, I'll burn. So what? Look at this. So now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, didn't stop him or send Jibreel. He gave the order to the fire. He said, Ya naru kuni bardan wa salaman ala Ibrahim. Oh, you fire, you be cold. Now, if it's too cold, rather than burning to death, he'll freeze to death. So that's going to be another problem. Bardan wa salaman ala Ibrahim. So be cold, cool, but peacefully cool. So in some riwayats it's mentioned that Ibrahim alayhi salam stayed in there for days, maybe even some riwayats say 40 days. I think that's a little bit stretching it. I don't know. Again, we can't really verify these riwayats, and Allah knows best. But in any case, it's also mentioned, he says, this was some of the best days of my life in that fire. So Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, so now obviously there's no stand for him in that place any longer. So he's not going to remain in Haran or in Babel or wherever that actually took place. So he took off and he left. Inni dhahibun ila Rabbi sayahdin. So I'm going to go, where I'm going to go? Ila Rabbi. I'm going to go to my Allah. So I'll travel and migrate until Allah takes me where he wants me to go. And fa'aman Lut, and his cousin Lut, his nephew Lut also believed in him and also went along with him. Inni muhajirun ila Rabbi sayahdin. And he also mentioned Sayyidina Lut alayhi salam, that I am also a muhajir, I am also a migrator in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with my uncle, and Allah will guide me. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala azizun hakim. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is most powerful and wise, and he'll guide us. So then, as I mentioned, so Lut alayhi salam, he actually settled in that area of Jordan, which is now, it's known as Karak, and it's known as Al-Ghor actually, and it's right next to the Dead Sea, and on the other side of the Dead Sea is what they call Israel. Okay, so now Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam continues with his hijrah ilallah, and this is Those who are searching, they continue searching physically and spiritually until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides them where He wants them to go. So they ultimately ended up in Egypt. Okay? So he and Sarah now end up in Egypt. And in the meantime, of course, they don't have any children, by the way. So Ibrahim alayhi salam and so these are the two people of Iman, along with Lut, right? These are the three people of Iman, on the planet right now, So, and obviously, a Nabi wants progeny so that tradition can carry on. So there in Egypt, it was a very interesting thing that happened, and this is mentioned in Hadith, and so we'll go to that story. Which I don't have in this presentation. I put it in the other presentation, but I'll just narrate that to you, inshallah. Otherwise, I wanted to show you that the writing that would be also helpful. So, in any case, what happened was, when Ibrahim alayhi salam entered with Sarah into Egypt, so they passed by a town, or a village, or a town, or probably a small city. Oh, you have that? Oh, you've got that one, but I don't have it in this. So the people on Zoom will not be seeing this. So if you want to see this, then you have to see on Facebook or YouTube or one of those social media. Okay, so what happened was that Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam and Sarah, they were passing by, and as we said, they're in migration. They're going wherever Allah guides them, and wherever He wants to take them. And so they passed through the village of this tyrant king, who is a tyrant, and whatever he wants, he gets it. So it was told to him that this fellow Ibrahim is here, he's traveling, and he's got one of the most beautiful women traveling with him. Okay? So he sends for Ibrahim and says, okay, who's this woman traveling with you? So Ibrahim is not only, a person of Iman, he's a person of very deep wisdom, and he realizes this fellow, he understands what he's after. So if I say I'm her husband, so he'll just dispense with me and carry on. So he said, she's my sister. And actually, he didn't tell a lie. It's mentioned in Hadith that Nabi alayhi salam said that actually Ibrahim said 3 white lies. They weren't actually lies, but they were what we call tarwiyah. Because she is his sister in Islam, right? So he wasn't telling a lie actually, but it was a kind of a hila. It was a kind of a sort of a way to get out of being nabbed by the king. So anyway, so then he goes back to Saudi. He says, "Look, this is what happened, and he's going to probably send for you, and I have no wherewithal to stop that, So, and I've told him that you're my sister, so don't tell him otherwise. Otherwise, it's going to be trouble for all of us." Okay, basically. So, she was brought to the king, and obviously the king wants what he wants. So now he starts making an advance towards Sarah. What does she do? In this riwayat, it's mentioned, and this is a riwayat Bukhari, by the way. In the meantime, what does she do? إِذَا حَزْبُ أَمْرُ فَزِيَ عَلَى الصَّلَاةِ. Nabi ﷺ says his habit was, if he had any problem, he would immediately go to Salat. So that's not only for our Nabi Muhammad, that was for all the prophets and the prophetic tradition. So Sarah, being the wife of a prophet and knowing that, what did she do? She performed wudu and she started offering Salat. Yeah? And she made this dua. She said, "Oh Allah, if I have actually believed in you and in your prophet, and if I have preserved my chastity except for my husband, then, stop this kafir." So what happened was that now this fellow is advancing, and it's like somebody's invisibly strangling him to death. And so to such extent his feet started, kicking. And he said, okay, and then in another riwayat, it's mentioned that, okay, pray to your God and let me go, and I won't hurt you. I'll leave you. And so in this riwayat, it's mentioned, she said, "Oh Allah, if he dies, then they're going to say I killed him. So that's going to be a bigger problem." So see, he was released. So then once he's released, he tries again. What happens? The same thing. He's getting strangled, and then, again she makes the wudu and the salat and makes dua. So this goes on for 3 times. Until ultimately he gives up and says, "You didn't bring me an insan, you didn't bring me a human being, you brought me some devil, You know, this woman is not a human being. Get rid of her. You know, and not only that, he gave for her khidmah, for her service, Hajar alayhi salam. Now this is where Hajar, enters into the picture, and actually she's known in the biblical. They say Hagar, and we say in Arabic Hajar, and usually people would say Hajara, being a woman, but actually she's mentioned in Hadith as Hajar. So now she is, and in this particular riwayat, وَأَخْتَمَ وَلِيدًا. Walida basically means a servant who was a slave girl, you see. So was she actually a slave girl? That is what is generally understood. There are some riwayats that point to that, in fact, she was actually the daughter of this king, which sounds a bit far-fetched to me, but again, we can't really verify those traditions because they're historic traditions. We don't have an unbroken chain of narration. In any case, the point is that it would have, for having the progeny coming from the mother who was a free woman rather than a slave. In any case, whatever the case may be, she was the wife of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. And then ultimately, she was given to Sarah, and Sarah actually gave her to Ibrahim alayhi salam as a wife, in the hopes that from her then a progeny would ensue. And that would take us to the next halaqah, and that will take us to the story of Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam. So that will be there in the next halaqah. And just to give you a preview, so if you want to, by the way, we are using basically, you can follow any major book of Sirah, but we are using the book of Revelation. I'll just show it to you here. So if you can get this book, it's a little bit expensive, but it's well worth it because it's just like a textbook. It's got a lot of information, and we basically go by this format. We add certain things, but it'll be very helpful. So if you want to review for the next halaqah, so we're going to be looking at Ismail alayhi salam and the Makkah and the Arabized tribes, or the Arab Musta'araba. So we're going to look at Ibrahim, Hajar, Ismail, their journey to Makkah, and Ibrahim leaves his family there, the appearance of Zamzam, and Ibrahim visits Ismail al-Fida in Mina. Ismail marries in Jurham, building the Kaaba, and then ultimately the institution of Hajj. Okay, so that's coming up next week, inshallah. So if you have any questions or anything you wanted to clarify, we have anything online? Okay.
But I had a question.
Yeah.
When or how exactly does Sarah come into the picture?
She comes into the picture. That's a good question, which it doesn't really mention. So somewhere along the line, somewhere probably there in Babel, or somewhere there in Iraq, she must have, they were married there, or did that take place actually in Palestine later on? Maybe. That's a good question. I really can't. I don't have the answer to that. So let's look it up. Maybe you can do that. Yeah, you look that up and find out. That's a good question. Yeah. Anything else? Do you have any questions? No? Okay, barakallahu feekum, jazakumullah khair. So I would like to thank everybody who tuned in, and those who will tune in, inshallah. You can also send this links to your friends and to your circles, inshallah. They can also benefit from that. And we'll be looking for you next Saturday, inshallah. Keep in mind that also on Thursday nights we have our salute class, so be with us on that as well. We're looking forward to having you. And jazakumullah kulla khair wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi